He grabbed the deed right out of her hands. Calvin Drake didn't snatch it. He plucked it, slow and deliberate, the way a man takes something he already considers his. He held it up to the light like he was checking for flaws in cheap fabric, then set it down on the counter and slid it back toward her with one finger, the way you'd return something contaminated. "You're going to lose this place inside a year," he said. Not cruel. Worse, certain. "A woman your size alone out here?" He let his eyes travel over her once, unhurried. "Prairie doesn't care about grit, Mrs. Mercer. Prairie takes what it wants." Every man in that feed store heard it. Not one of them said a word. Abigail Mercer picked up the deed, folded it twice along its original crease, and put it back in her coat pocket without looking at him. But her hands were shaking, and she knew he saw it. If that had been you, if you had walked out of that store with 11 acres of dying land, 37 cents to your name, and an entire town convinced you were already finished, what would you have done? That is the question Abigail Mercer lived with every single morning she woke up on that Kansas prairie. And what she did next, with 39 sick, half-dead geese that everyone laughed at, became the thing nobody in that valley ever forgot. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that the people the world writes off are often the ones who change everything, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories just like this one, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Abigail's story travels. Now let's go back to where this all began. Oak. The land had been her husband's dream, not hers. Thomas Mercer had talked about those 11 Kansas acres the entire 3 years of their marriage. Talked about them over supper. Talked about them while he repaired fences on borrowed property. Talked about them in that low, hopeful voice men use when they're not sure hope is something they deserve. He'd made one payment on the deed before the fever took him in February of 1891, and the land passed to Abigail along with 2 outstanding debts, a broken wagon wheel, and a cast-iron stove that listed badly to the left. She was 27 years old. She weighed 240 pounds. She had never once in her life run a farm alone. The neighbors came to the burial. That much she'd give them. But the conversation she overheard while standing over Thomas's grave told her exactly what kind of support she could expect going forward. Agnes Hooper, whose husband ran the dry goods, leaned toward Martha Birch and said something about that poor woman in a tone that had nothing kind in it. Jim Bellard, who owned the adjacent property to the west, spent most of the service studying her acreage from a distance, already calculating. Abigail heard all of it. She'd been hearing things she wasn't supposed to hear her whole life. Large women became invisible in a strange way. People looked past them, spoke around them, assumed their feelings were as dull and unremarkable as their bodies were presumed to be. It had been happening to her since she was 14 years old, and somewhere along the way she'd learned to use it. You hear the truth when people think you're not worth hiding it from. She went home after the burial and sat at Thomas's listing stove and made a list. It was not a sentimental list. It was the kind of list a person makes when sentiment is a luxury they can't currently afford. What she had, what she owed, what she needed to survive the next 6 months. The numbers were not good. The numbers were, in fact, the kind of numbers that would have sent a practical person straight to Jim Bellard's door to discuss a sale. Abigail was practical. She just wasn't the kind of practical that quit. She had the land. She had seeds, barely enough for a half-decent kitchen garden. She had no horse. The horse had been sold to pay the second debt. And no dog, because dogs cost money and ate money, and the kind of dog big enough to guard an isolated homestead cost more money than she had. She had no nearby family. She had no hired help and no means to pay for any. What she had, essentially, was 11 acres of tired Kansas soil, a bad stove, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had already been told too many times in her life what she couldn't do. The predator problem kept her up at night. 3 farms within 6 miles had reported losses that winter. Chickens gone, a calf taken, a cellar broken into and stripped. Everyone blamed coyotes for the livestock, and 2 of those break-ins had human boot prints in the mud around the cellar doors, which meant coyotes wasn't quite the whole story. Without a dog, without a man, without so much as a neighbor close enough to hear her shout, Abigail's little homestead sat out on the open prairie like an invitation. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She made 3 more lists. She walked the perimeter of her property at dusk 4 evenings in a row, studying the approaches, noting the sight lines, thinking about what Thomas used to say about the old Mercer farm back in Ohio, where his grandfather kept geese. Hear everything, Thomas had said. Don't sleep. Don't forget. Don't forgive. He'd meant it fondly, the way people talk about a beloved eccentric relative. But Abigail had filed the information away the way she filed everything, quietly, without announcement. She drove the borrowed wagon to Haskell County on a Tuesday in early March because she'd heard from a woman at the post office that a farm there was liquidating. The Dooley place. Illness in the family, the whole operation going to pieces. The woman at the post office had mentioned it almost as an aside, the way you mention things that don't seem important. What Abigail found at the Dooley place was 39 geese in a condition that explained exactly why no one had bought them yet. They were in bad shape. There was no soft way to say it. The pen was overcrowded, the feed had clearly been irregular for months, and at least 6 of the birds had a respiratory thing that made them sound like old men with bad lungs. 3 were limping. 1 sat apart from the others with the particular stillness of an animal that has stopped arguing with its own body about what happens next. Elmer Dooley was 60, hollow-cheeked, apologetic, in the way of people who've watched everything go wrong and run out of explanations. He said he'd take $2 for the lot because, frankly, he needed them gone more than he needed the money. Abigail looked at those geese for a long time. She thought about the money, the 37 cents currently in her coat pocket, and the $1.60 she'd left back at the homestead in the tobacco tin above the stove, which represented the entirety of her liquid assets. She thought about every sensible voice in her head, which were numerous and loud and all saying the same thing. Then she thought about Thomas's grandfather's farm in Ohio and what Thomas had said about the geese. She gave Elmer Dooley the $2. It was every cent she had. She loaded 39 sick geese into the back of the borrowed wagon and drove home under a sky the color of old pewter. And she didn't let herself think too hard about what she'd just done, because if she thought too hard about it, she might have to admit that it was, by any conventional measure, a catastrophic decision. She found out soon enough what people thought about it. She hadn't even finished unloading the wagon when Agnes Hooper materialized at the fence line. Agnes had a gift for appearing exactly when her presence was least useful, and stood with both hands folded over the top rail, watching the proceedings with the particular expression of someone compiling material. "Those are sick birds," Agnes said. "I know that," Abigail said. "You paid money for sick birds." "I'm aware of what I did, Agnes." There was a pause while Agnes watched one of the geese attempt to navigate the yard and stumble slightly. "Well," Agnes said, and that one word carried more information than most people could fit in a paragraph. By Friday, Abigail gathered, the story had made the rounds. She knew because Owen Barrett showed up at her gate. Owen was 14, gangly, the youngest of the Barrett boys from the farm, half a mile east, and he had that quality some quiet children have of absorbing more than they're supposed to. And he stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and said, without preamble, that he'd heard about the geese. "I expect you did," Abigail said. "My pa says you wasted your money." Owen looked at the flock, which was currently spread across the yard in various states of recovery. "He says anyone could see those birds are half dead." "What do you say?" Owen considered this seriously. He was the kind of boy who considered things seriously, which was probably why the other boys didn't much like him. "I think they're sick," he said finally. "But the big gray one in the back, she's watching everything, has been since I got here. That one's not half dead." Abigail looked at the big gray goose in the back of the yard. Owen was right. She was watching the gate, watching Owen, watching Abigail, missing nothing. "You want to help me?" Abigail asked. "My pa won't pay you anything for my time," Owen said, which was a 14-year-old's way of saying his father's opinion was a complication he couldn't resolve. "I'm not asking your pa," Abigail said. "I'm asking you." Owen put his hat back on. "I could come mornings," he said, "before the other chores." That was how that started. The feed store incident came 10 days later. She'd gone in for corn, which she needed and could barely afford, and Calvin Drake was there, which he almost always was because Calvin Drake owned half the commercial property on the main street of Grover's Mill and made a point of being visible in all of it. He was 51, broad, the kind of man whose confidence had calcified somewhere around age 30 into something that looked like authority, but was really just certainty that no one would push back. He had looked at her deed. She'd brought it to verify the property description for a seed catalog order. And he had done that thing with it, that slow, deliberate pluck, and he had said what he said about the prairie and about her size, and every man in that store had heard it, and not one of them had said a word. Abigail had walked out with the deed in her pocket and her hands shaking. She made it to the wagon before she stopped. She put both hands on the side of the wagon, and she stood there breathing for a moment, not because she was about to cry. She was not about to cry. She was far past the age of crying at Calvin Drake. But because she needed to let the fury move through her in an organized way rather than an unorganized one. She thought about what it would cost her to go back in there and say what she wanted to say. She thought about what it would cost her to say nothing. She climbed up into the wagon and drove home. That evening, she sat at the listing stove and watched the geese through the window. The sickest ones were responding to the regiment she'd put them on. Clean water twice a day, the pen cleaned out properly, the feed adjusted and supplemented with what she could spare. The big gray goose, she'd started thinking of her as the general, though she hadn't said that out loud because she was aware of how it sounded, moved through the flock with a purposeful quality that Abigail found genuinely remarkable. When something startled the others, they looked to the general. When the general settled, they settled. And the general, Abigail had noticed, never fully settled. Not even at night. She'd gone out at 2 a.m, 3 nights running, checking the property the way she couldn't stop herself from doing, and every time the general was awake, positioned near the fence facing the road, watching. Owen noticed it too. He came every morning now without being asked, just appeared at the gate at 6:15 with the particular reliability of someone who has decided a thing without making an announcement about it. I was learning the birds faster than she'd expected. Which ones were timid, which were bold, which ones had the sharpest hearing. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. The boys who talked a lot at 14 were usually performing for someone, and Owen didn't seem interested in performance. "What do you think they'll say at school?" she asked him one morning while they were working the pen. "About you helping a woman like me." Owen didn't look up from what he was doing. "They already say stuff," he said. "What kind of stuff?" "That you're too big to run a farm. That you're going to fail before summer." He paused. "That anyone who helps you is probably stupid." "Are you stupid?" "No," Owen said, without any particular emphasis, as if the question didn't need more than that. "Then you've got your answer," Abigail said. She found out about the second round of break-ins from Jim Bellard, who stopped at her fence one afternoon looking shaken in a way she'd never seen Jim Bellard look shaken. Someone had taken half his winter stores from his second cellar overnight. His dog, a big working animal that Jim was proud of, had not made a sound. Jim found the dog the next morning shut in the barn, which meant whoever had done it knew the property and knew the dog. "You had any trouble?" Jim asked, and there was something in the way he asked it that made Abigail understand he wasn't asking out of neighborly concern. He was asking because he was trying to understand something. "No," she said. "Not so far." Jim looked at her yard where the flock was spread out doing what the flock always did, moving, grazing, watching. "Those things loud?" he asked. "Extremely," she said. Jim said nothing else. But he stood at the fence for a minute longer than the conversation required, looking at the geese with an expression she didn't try to read. She went inside and made another list. She was 3 weeks into the goose experiment, and the results were beginning to accumulate in a way that felt, cautiously, like something. The sick ones were recovering. The 3 that had been limping were walking clean. The one that had sat apart with that final stillness had, against what she'd privately assumed, rejoined the flock and was eating well. The respiratory thing was clearing, and the alarms had started. The first one was a coyote, 2 nights in. The eruption of noise was immediate, total, and so violent that Abigail had thrown herself out of bed and halfway across the room before she was fully awake. By the time she got outside with the lantern, the coyote was gone. She could see the depression in the grass at the edge of the property where it had come through the fence gap. And the flock was still in full alarm, every bird facing the same direction, the sound carrying out across the open prairie in a way that would have reached every neighboring homestead within a quarter mile. The second alarm was something she hadn't expected. She'd been inside when it started, and the character of it was different. Not the sharp, explosive alarm of the coyote sighting, but a lower, sustained, intensely directed sound. And when she got outside, she followed the general's line of sight toward the road and saw, at the edge of where her lantern light reached, a figure standing very still in the darkness. The figure stood there for maybe 10 seconds, then it turned and walked away fast. She never saw who it was. She stood in her yard in the cold dark with the lantern burning and the flock quieting around her, and she thought about what Calvin Drake had said in the feed store about the prairie taking what it wants. Maybe that was true. Maybe the prairie took what it could get, but the prairie had 39 geese standing between it and everything she had left. And for the first time since Thomas died, standing out there in the dark, with the general settling back into her watching position by the fence, Abigail Mercer felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not safe, exactly. Something better than safe. She felt like she might actually win this. The figure on the road didn't come back. That was the thing Abigail kept turning over in her mind the next morning while she worked the pen, the cold still sitting in her fingers from the night before. Whoever it had been, they'd stood at the edge of the lantern light long enough to make a decision, and the decision they'd made was to leave. The geese had done that. Not a fence, not a dog, not a man with a rifle. 39 recovering birds in a yard on the Kansas prairie had convinced someone with unknown intentions to turn around and walk away in the dark. She didn't tell anyone about it. Not Owen, not Jim Bellard, not the post office woman whose name was Pearl, and who functioned as the primary information distribution system for the entire valley. She kept it the way she kept most things that mattered: close, quiet, private, useful. Owen showed up at 6:15 the way he always did, and she handed him the feed bucket without ceremony, and they worked through the morning routine the way they'd developed it over the past few weeks, which was to say, without a great deal of unnecessary conversation. Owen had a quality she'd noticed in very few people his age or any other age, which was the ability to be present without demanding acknowledgement of that presence. He watched the birds the way she watched the birds, carefully, patiently, with genuine attention. "The gray one didn't eat this morning," he said, not alarmed, just noting it. Abigail looked over at the general. The big gray goose was stationed near the east fence, positioned the way she always positioned herself, watching the road. "She ate last night," Abigail said. "She does that sometimes. Eats heavy the night before and light in the morning." Owen looked at the general for a moment. "Like she's rationing herself," he said. "Something like that." Owen picked up the empty bucket and stood there another second. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "my pa was talking at supper last night." She waited. "He said Calvin Drake was in the feed store again. Said he was talking about your place." Owen kept his eyes on the bucket. "Said Drake was telling people that the geese were going to cause problems, that they're too loud and someone was going to petition the council about it." Abigail felt the familiar slow burn start somewhere behind her sternum, the one that had been living there more or less permanently since the deed incident. "Drake say anything else?" "He said—" Owen stopped, started again. "He said a woman who can't manage herself probably can't manage a farm either." The burn got hotter. "What did your father say to that?" she asked. Owen's jaw moved slightly. "He laughed," he said. "Just that." He set the bucket down against the fence post and picked up the rake and went back to work, and Abigail understood from the set of his shoulders that he was not proud of that answer, and had not been proud of it at the supper table either. She let it go. There were things you pushed on and things you didn't, and a 14-year-old boy's complicated feelings about his father were firmly in the category of things you didn't. But she thought about Calvin Drake all day. She thought about him while she worked the soil in the kitchen garden, turning the tired earth over with a persistence that was half practical and half a way of directing energy that had nowhere better to go. She thought about him while she mended the east section of fence that had been listing for a week. She thought about him while she sat at the listing stove that evening, eating the kind of supper that was more about sustenance than pleasure. Hardtack and salt pork, and some dried apple that was getting long in the tooth. And she made a list, which was what she always did when she needed to think. The list had 2 columns. What Calvin Drake had. What she had. His column was longer. She was honest about that. He had money, influence, the council's ear, the social machinery of Grover's Mill running in his favor, and 30 years of established presence in the valley. He had the particular power that came from being the kind of man people assumed was right, simply because he'd always acted like it. Her column had the land, the geese, Owen, and the specific stubbornness that she'd once considered a character flaw and had revised her opinion on. She looked at both columns for a long time. Then she put the list away and went to bed. Spring came to the Kansas prairie the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day, then 3 cold ones. Rain that came sideways. A morning so clear and still it felt like an apology for everything that had come before. Abigail worked through all of it, and the geese worked through all of it with her, and by the middle of April something had shifted on the little 11-acre homestead that she hadn't entirely planned for. The crops were coming in. Not explosively, not in the way of a bumper season, but steadily, which was more than she dared to expect from exhausted soil. The kitchen garden was producing. The larger field, she'd planted it in winter wheat the previous fall, one of the last things she'd done with Thomas's money, had come through the winter better than Jim Bellard's wheat to the west, which had struggled with a grub problem that had apparently devastated the root systems of half his planting. Jim had mentioned this over the fence with a face like a man counting losses he can't afford, and then he'd looked at her field and said nothing, but the nothing was loud. Abigail knew why her wheat had fared better, and it wasn't luck. The geese had spent the fall and early winter working the field perimeter, and geese, as it turned out, were extraordinarily efficient at consuming the kind of insects and larvae that destroyed root systems. She hadn't planned that specifically. She'd known geese ate pests, that had been part of her calculation. But the scale of it was beyond what she'd anticipated. The birds moved through the field borders with a systematic quality that reminded her, a little uncomfortably, of how she made her lists. Pearl at the post office mentioned the wheat in mid-April, which meant people were noticing. "Heard your winter wheat came through nice," Pearl said, with that particular brightness that meant the information had already been thoroughly circulated, and Pearl was the last stop on its journey. "It did all right," Abigail said. "Jim Bellard lost near a third of his planting." Pearl paused to let that sit. His wife said it was the worst grub year she'd ever seen. "I heard that. Funny years didn't have the same trouble." "It wasn't funny," Abigail said. "It was the geese." Pearl looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. "The geese," she repeated. "They ate the grubs, all fall and into winter. I didn't plan the timing of it exactly right, but it worked out." She paused. "Or most of it worked out." Pearl opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "Well, I'll be." Which was how it started. Not with anything dramatic, but with Pearl at the post office saying, "Well, I'll be." And that phrase making its own circuit through the valley over the following 2 weeks. Owen heard about it before Abigail did, because Owen heard about most things before she did, being 14 and therefore invisible in the specific way that children are invisible in adult conversations, present and unregistered. He came to the gate one morning in late April with the news that the Barrett Farms neighbor to the north, a man named Henry Crisp, had lost 2 hogs to what he believed was a coyote that had gotten into his pen overnight. Henry's dog had slept through the whole thing. Henry was furious in the particular way of men who've directed their fury at the wrong target, and the wrong target in this case was the dog. "He's going to shoot the dog," Owen said, flat. "That's not the dog's fault," Abigail said. "I know that. The dog didn't choose to sleep through it. That's what dogs do." She looked out at the flock. "They sleep, they get comfortable. They decide things are safe when things aren't safe." She paused. "Geese don't do that." Owen looked at the general, who was, as usual, watching. "Why not?" It was a genuine question, and Abigail had thought about it enough to have a genuine answer. "Geese are prey animals," she said. "Always have been. They never evolved the luxury of feeling truly safe, so they never stopped watching for the thing that's going to get them. That anxiety that looks like a flaw, it's actually the whole point." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like some people I know," he said. Abigail looked at him. He was staring at the general with an expression she couldn't quite read, something older than 14 in it. "Yes," she said. "It does." The coyote problem reached her own fence in early May. She heard the alarm at midnight, the full eruption, every bird at once, the sound so immediate and total it felt physical, like something hitting the air rather than coming through it. She was outside before the sound fully registered, the lantern in one hand and the old shotgun Thomas had left. She'd only fired it twice in her life and wasn't confident about either occasion in the other. The coyote was at the south fence. Not 1, 3. They'd come in a group, which she'd been told was unusual, but which made a kind of predatory sense. A single animal tests a defense. A group exploits the gap. They were working the fence line, looking for the gap she'd repaired 2 weeks ago, and the geese were lined up on the interior side of that fence in a wall of noise and wing-spreading aggression that was genuinely alarming to witness. The coyotes saw her lantern and ran. She stood at the south fence in the May dark for a long time afterward, listening to the prairie settle back into its nighttime sounds, the flock gradually winding down from alarm to vigilance to the general's baseline watchfulness. The fence gap she'd repaired held. The coyotes had found no way in. She went back to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling, not sleeping, going through the numbers in her head. The flock was healthy now. Truly healthy. All 39 birds in working condition. The respiratory problem resolved. The limping birds walking clean. They were producing eggs, which she was selling to Pearl's husband at a price that wasn't making her rich, but was making the difference between barely possible and somewhat possible. The wheat was going to yield. The kitchen garden was producing. The geese were working. For the first time since February, she ran the numbers and they didn't end in disaster. She was so surprised by this that she did the arithmetic 3 times. The arithmetic kept coming out the same. She made a list. She always made a list. But this one was different from the others. This one had a future column. What she could do by fall if things continued the way they were going. What she could do by next spring. It was a modest list, nothing extravagant, maybe a second pen, maybe expanding the flock if she could find healthy birds at a reasonable price, maybe fixing the roof properly rather than the patch job she'd done in March that she didn't entirely trust. But it was a future, an actual future on this land, with these birds, which was more than she'd been able to say at any point since Thomas died. She heard about the Hennessy farm in the second week of May, and that was when things in the valley shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. The Hennessy family, Frank and Dora, 4 children, a solid operation about 3 miles northwest, had been hit by what Frank was calling organized theft. Not a coyote, not opportunistic petty stealing. Someone had come in 2 nights running, gotten into the main barn without making the dogs bark, and taken tools. Good tools, the expensive kind, the kind you can sell in a town far enough away that no one asks questions. Frank's 2 working dogs had been, both nights, silent. Frank came to Abigail's fence. This was notable. Frank Hennessy was not a man who came to fences. He was a man who stayed on his own property and did his own business and expressed no opinions about other people's unless pressed, which was a quality Abigail had always respected even from a distance. His being at her fence meant something had broken through his usual self-sufficiency. "I heard your birds raised an alarm," he said. Not a question. He'd heard something specific. "A few times," she said. "Coyotes mostly. One time I'm not sure what." Frank looked at the flock with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head. He was 50 or so, weathered, not unfriendly, just careful. "They ever give you false alarms?" Abigail thought about it honestly. "Once," she said. "First week. One of the younger birds set them all off, and I think it was just nerves, maybe. She was still sick. She's settled down since. One false alarm in," he calculated, 6, 7 weeks? Something like that. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My dogs are good dogs. I want to be clear about that. They're not lazy animals." "I know that," Abigail said, because she did. "But they slept through 2 nights of people in my barn." His voice didn't crack, but something in it tightened. 2 nights. "I know," she said. And then, carefully, "The thing about dogs is they can be managed. Someone who knows dogs can manage them. Geese can't be managed that way. You can't make friends with a goose." Frank looked at her. "No," he said. "I imagine you can't." He stood at the fence for another minute, then nodded once and walked back toward his property, and Abigail stood watching him go and thinking about what that conversation meant. Frank Hennessy had come to her fence. Frank Hennessy was interested. Owen materialized beside her. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was becoming a habit of his. "Mr. Hennessy coming to talk to you," he said, with the tone of someone marking a significant event. Abigail said. "My pa would never come talk to you." "I know that." Owen picked up the feed bucket. "Mr. Drake was at our place yesterday," he said, in the careful voice he used when he was delivering information he wasn't sure how to classify. She turned to look at him. "He came to talk to Pa about the goose ordinance." Owen kept his eyes on the bucket. "He's going around to the farms, getting people to sign something, saying the noise is a disturbance to the community and a health concern. A health concern, she repeated. That's what he said. Did your father sign? Owen was quiet for a moment that answered the question before he did. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't even particularly angry, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected the anger, but what she felt instead was something more like clarity, the kind that comes when you stop hoping a thing won't happen and start thinking about what you do when it does. How many signatures does he need? She asked. I don't know, but he was talking like he already had enough. She went inside that evening and made a list. Then she threw the list away and made a different one. The thing about Calvin Drake, she'd decided, was that he operated on the assumption that people with less power than him would respond to pressure the way water responds to a dam. They'd build up, push a little, and then find the path of least resistance. He'd seen it work enough times that he'd stopped questioning whether it would work. That was his flaw. He'd confused a pattern for a law. She was not water. The early days of June brought heat that pressed down on the valley like something with intent, and with the heat came the fullest demonstration yet of what 39 healthy geese could do for a working farm. The pest pressure that summer was unusual. She heard this from Pearl, from Frank Hennessy when he came back to the fence twice more, from Jim Bellard who'd stopped pretending he wasn't paying attention to her operation. The insects were bad in a way that old-timers were saying they hadn't seen in 15 years. The kind of year where a farm that couldn't manage its pest situation would lose significant portions of its crop without any dramatic event, just a slow bleeding out, a little more each week until the math stopped working. On Abigail's 11 acres, the geese worked the field perimeters every single morning and evening, and the pest pressure was, by any observable measure, a fraction of what her neighbors were experiencing. Jim Bellard came to her fence on a Thursday afternoon and didn't pretend about anything. "What are you doing with them that I'm not doing?" he asked, and there was no hostility in it now, just a genuine question from a man who was watching something that didn't fit his prior understanding. "Nothing exotic," she said. "Clean water, regular feed, a routine. They do the rest." "I lost 8% of my corn to the beetles," Jim said. 8%? And it's only June." "I know." "You've lost what?" She considered. "Maybe 2.5. Jim looked at the flock working the field border, the steady, purposeful movement of it, the way they missed nothing. "I laughed," he said abruptly. She waited. "At the feed store. When Drake was talking about you." He said it directly, which was more than she'd expected from Jim Bellard. "I didn't say anything, but I laughed." He looked at her. "I'm telling you that because I think you probably know, and I'd rather say it plain." "I appreciate that," she said, and meant it, because she did appreciate it, not because it changed anything, but because plainness was its own kind of respect. "Drake's got 7 signatures on that petition," Jim said. "I'm not one of them, in case you were wondering." She hadn't been sure enough to wonder. "Thank you, Jim." He left, and she stood at her fence for a while with the heat pressing down and the flock working the field behind her. And she thought about 7 signatures and what that meant for the council meeting that Pearl had told her was being scheduled for July. Owen had started to change, she noticed, sometime around the end of May. Not dramatically. Owen didn't do things dramatically, but in small, observable ways. He'd stopped arriving at 6:15 and started arriving at 6. He'd stopped asking questions about the basic routines because he knew the basic routines. He was working with the individual birds now in a way that showed he'd been studying them privately, building his own understanding of the flock's hierarchy and temperament, which bird would follow the general into an alarm and which one hesitated, which bird ranged wide and which stayed close. He'd named them. She discovered this one morning when he referred to one of the younger ganders as Stockton, with complete unself-consciousness, and then looked briefly embarrassed when he realized she'd heard it. "How many of them have names?" she asked. He looked at the fence post. "Most of them." "What's the general's name?" "I didn't—" He stopped. "You call her the general." "In my head. I haven't said it out loud before." Owen looked at the big gray goose, who was in her usual position at the east fence, watching the road with characteristic intensity. "I've been calling her Hazel," he said, "because of the color of her—" He stopped again. "Eyes," Abigail said. "Yes." She looked at the general, at Hazel, and thought about a 14-year-old boy who named Geese and came to her gate at 6 in the morning, not because anyone told him to, but because he decided this was where he needed to be, in a valley where his own father had signed his name to a document designed to destroy her livelihood. "Hazel's a better name," she said. Owen's shoulders did something small and complicated. It was in the 3rd week of June that the thing happened with the Claiborne boy, and that was when Abigail understood that the situation was moving faster than she'd calculated and in a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. Tom Claiborne was 17, the oldest son of Robert Claiborne, who ran the mill at the north end of the valley. Tom had a reputation that everyone in the valley knew, and most people avoided specifying. The kind of reputation that accumulates around a young man who's been given too much latitude by a father who'd rather not look directly at what he's raised. He wasn't violent, exactly. He was the kind of person who did things and then watched to see what happened, which in some people was curiosity, and in Tom Claiborne was something that felt more like appetite. He came down the road past her property on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his usual companions, and he stopped at her fence and looked at the flock with the particular expression of someone formulating a plan. She was in the field, and she saw him. She kept working, but she watched. He said something to the other 2 boys she couldn't hear. One of them laughed. Then Tom Claiborne picked up a stone from the road and threw it into her yard. The geese erupted. Not in the scattered panic of birds who don't know what's happening. In the organized, directed alarm of a flock that knows exactly what's happening and exactly where the threat is. Every bird faced the fence. The sound was immediate and enormous. Hazel moved to the front. Her wings spread, her neck stretched forward in that posture that, even in an animal, communicated something distinctly like fury. Tom Claiborne took a step back from the fence, then another. His companions were already backing away. Abigail put down the tool she was holding and walked toward the fence at a pace that was unhurried but deliberate. She watched Tom Claiborne's face as she approached, watched him try to recompose the expression that the geese had startled off it, the casual performance of someone who doesn't care. Reassembling over the thing underneath which was a 17-year-old boy who had just been frightened by birds and knew she'd seen it. She stopped at the fence and looked at him. "Something you need?" she asked. "Just walking," he said. She looked at the stone in the yard, visible on the ground where it had landed. She didn't look at Tom Claiborne again. She just looked at the stone. Tom Claiborne left. Faster than he wanted to, she could tell from the stiffness of his back as he walked. The flock settled. Hazel watched the road until the 3 boys were completely out of sight. Abigail stood at the fence with her hand resting on the top rail, and something moving through her that was half anger and half something she didn't have a clean name for. A complex feeling, the way you feel when you understand that what's coming at you is organized and has a shape and is not going to stop on its own. Tom Claiborne was Robert Claiborne's son. Robert Claiborne sat on the town council. Robert Claiborne had been in the feed store that day with Calvin Drake. She thought about 7 signatures and a council meeting in July and a stone thrown into a yard on a Tuesday afternoon, and she thought about how these things were probably not unrelated. She went inside and made a list. Then she sat down and wrote a letter. Not to the council, not to Drake, not to anyone official. She wrote it to Frank Hennessy, 3 miles northwest, who had come to her fence twice and who had lost $80 in tools to thieves his dogs hadn't heard. The letter said she'd like to talk if he had the time, and that she had a proposal she thought might interest him, and that she'd be grateful for his discretion. She walked it to the post office herself the next morning, before the heat came up. Pearl looked at the address on the envelope and looked at Abigail and said nothing, which was, for Pearl, a significant exercise of restraint. Abigail walked home through the early morning, the light still low and thin and honest, the kind of light that didn't improve things or disguise them but showed them as they were. Her land, her field, with the wheat coming in. Her fence, mended and remended. Her yard, with 39 birds that 2 months ago everyone in the valley had laughed at. She thought about what Owen had said that first morning, the big gray one in the back. She's watching everything. And she thought about Tom Claiborne taking a step back, then another. There was a lesson in that. Not a comfortable one, not a triumphant one. She was too practical for triumph at this stage, but a real one. The world responded to being watched. The world responded to the thing that didn't sleep, didn't get comfortable, didn't decide things were safe because they'd been safe yesterday. She'd built something here, something that worked, and someone was going to try to take it from her. She'd expected that. She'd been expecting it since the day she walked out of the feed store with shaking hands and Calvin Drake's voice in her head saying the Prairie takes what it wants. She'd spent every day since then making sure the Prairie would find the taking harder than he thought. The letter to Frank Hennessy went out on a Wednesday. By Friday, she had his response, which was 3 lines, no wasted words. He'd come Saturday morning, if that suited her. He'd bring his wife Dora, who had a good head for these things, and he was obliged to her for the discretion. She wrote Saturday on a scrap of paper and pinned it above the listing stove where she could see it. Then she went out to check on the flock. Hazel was at the east fence, watching the road, missing nothing. "We've got work to do," Abigail told her. Hazel didn't respond because she was a goose, but she turned her head slightly, the way she did sometimes, the gold hazel eye catching the morning light, and then she turned back to the road. Watching. Frank Hennessy arrived on Saturday morning with Dora beside him on the wagon seat, and Abigail knew within the first 30 seconds of watching them come down the road that she'd made the right call writing that letter. Frank was the kind of man who sat straight even when he was tired, not out of pride but out of habit, the posture of someone who'd been doing hard work long enough that his body had simply organized itself around the effort. Dora was smaller, quicker-eyed, and Abigail had the immediate sense that Dora had been the one to convince Frank to come, not the other way around. They stood at the fence for a moment looking at the flock before anyone said anything. This was something Abigail had learned about the people who came to her fence. The ones worth talking to always looked at the geese first. They watched the way the flock moved, the purposeful quality of it. Hazel at the east post doing her unceasing inventory of everything within sight range. "They're bigger than I thought," Dora said. "Most people think geese are smaller than they are," Abigail said, "until they're standing next to one." Dora nodded slowly. "How many eggs are you getting?" "Averaging 11 a day from the layers. I'm selling 8 to Pearl's husband and keeping the rest." "That's not nothing," Dora said, with the tone of a woman who had run the numbers on nothing before and understood the distinction. Frank had not stopped looking at the flock. "You said you had a proposal," he said, which was Frank's way of saying he appreciated her time and didn't want to waste it. She'd thought about how to put it for 3 days, and she'd decided that the direct version was the only version that would work with Frank Hennessy. "Drake's petition has 7 signatures," she said. "He needs 9 for the council to call a formal vote on the ordinance. I think he's going to get them. I think the vote is going to happen in July, and I think if the vote goes against me, I lose the geese and I lose the farm inside of 6 months." Frank nodded, not sympathetically, just acknowledgement that she'd assessed the situation correctly. "What I'm proposing," she said, "is that before that vote happens, the Valley has a concrete demonstration of what this flock is worth. Not to me, to everyone." She paused. "You lost $80 in tools to someone who knew how to handle your dogs. Henry Crisp lost 2 hogs. The Bellard grub problem cost him near a third of his early corn." She let that sit for a moment. Drake is framing this as one woman with noisy birds that annoy the community. "I want to reframe it before the vote." Dora looked at Frank. Frank looked at Abigail. "How?" Frank said. "I want to offer breeding pairs," she said, "to any farm that wants them, at a fair price, with advice on how to manage them. Before the vote. Not after. Before. So that when the council sits down to decide whether my flock is a nuisance, there are 6 or 8 farms in this valley with their own birds, and those farmers are not going to vote to eliminate a practice they've just invested in." There was a silence. Frank took off his hat, looked at the inside of it for a moment, put it back on. "You're not just protecting your farm," Dora said. It wasn't a question. "No," Abigail said, "but I'm also not going to pretend that protecting my farm isn't part of it." Dora almost smiled. "Good. I don't trust people who pretend." Frank said, "I'll take a pair." She hadn't expected it to happen that fast. "You haven't asked the price." "What's the price?" She named a number she'd calculated carefully. Fair, but not cheap, because cheap would signal desperation, and she needed to signal the opposite. Frank nodded without negotiating, which told her he'd already decided before he arrived, and the conversation had just been confirmation. "I'll talk to Henry Crisp," Frank said. "And the Okafor family up north. They're having a bad year with theft, too. Somebody broke their smokehouse in April." He paused. "I won't promise anything for them, but I'll talk." "That's all I'm asking," Abigail said. After they left, she stood in the yard for a long time, and Hazel came and positioned herself nearby in that way she'd developed over the weeks. Not affectionate exactly. Geese weren't affectionate, but proximate, the way a sentry stands near the thing they're tasked with protecting. Abigail looked at the big gray goose and felt something she hadn't felt in months, which was not optimism. She didn't trust optimism, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of having moved a piece on a board. Owen arrived early that morning, which meant he'd watched the Hennessy wagon leave from somewhere down the road. He didn't ask directly. He just stood at the gate with an expression of concentrated neutrality that she'd learned to read as intense curiosity. "Frank Hennessy is going to buy a breeding pair," she said. Owen's face did something complicated and quickly controlled. "Pa is going to have opinions about that," he said. "Your pa already has opinions about everything I do. These ones might be louder." She looked at him. "Owen, is your father going to be a problem for you because of this?" Owen considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "He has opinions," he said again, "but he doesn't stop me from going where I decide to go." A pause. "He tried once. Didn't work out the way he planned." She didn't push it, but she thought about it. Thought about what it cost a 14-year-old to stand at this gate every morning against the combined weight of his father's opinions and Calvin Drake's campaign and the social arithmetic of a small valley that had decided she was a joke. She thought about what that kind of decision does to a person over time, and she thought it probably did one of two things. Either it built them into something, or it broke them. And Owen Barrett, quiet and precise and giving names to geese in private, was not the kind that broke. The second week of June moved faster than she'd expected. Frank was as good as his word. By Tuesday, she had a message from Henry Crisp, written in the cramped handwriting of a man who didn't write often. He was interested in a pair if the price was reasonable, and could she come by Thursday or send someone? She sent Owen because Owen had become, without either of them formally deciding it, her representative in situations where her own presence would be complicated by the specific fact of being her. He came back Thursday afternoon with Henry Crisp's agreement and a handshake deposit, a silver $1.50 that he placed on the table beside her stove with the careful precision of someone handling something significant. "He asked if they'd be as loud as yours," Owen said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him probably, and that was the point." She nodded. "Good." "He laughed," Owen said. "The good kind." That was a distinction she'd learned to pay attention to. The laughs in this valley had two types, and the difference between them was everything. The Okafor family was a different conversation. Kwame Okafor had come from Georgia 12 years ago with his wife Celestine and built their farm from ground that everyone said couldn't be farmed, which meant Abigail and Kwame shared a certain biographical similarity that neither of them commented on, but both of them understood. He came to her fence himself on Friday, without advance notice, which she'd come to understand was his way of doing things, direct, without the formality of arrangements. He was a tall man, 50 or so, with the kind of face that didn't waste expression. He looked at the flock for a solid minute without saying anything. "Frank Hennessy says you're the only farm in the valley that hasn't lost anything this season," he said. "I lost a little wheat to the weather in March," she said. "But to predators or theft, nothing." "Nothing," he repeated as if testing the weight of the word. "Nothing." He looked at Hazel. "Is that one the leader?" "She is." "She looks like she's counting something." "I think she is," Abigail said. "I think she's always counting." Kwame was quiet for another moment. Then, "My smokehouse. Whoever broke in, they knew the property. They knew where my dog slept. They knew which nights my son wasn't around." He said this without particular emotion, but the lack of emotion was itself a kind of weight. "That's not an animal problem. That's a people problem." "Yes." "Your birds can handle a people problem?" "They don't sleep," she said. "They don't make friends. They don't decide something's safe because it was safe last week. And they're loud enough that when they raise an alarm, every neighbor within half a mile hears it." Kwame looked at her directly. "The petition," he said. "You heard her about it." "Drake came to my farm." His voice was level. "He said the birds were a health concern. He said a community needs orderly operation, not—" He stopped. He used a few other words. She waited. "I told him to get off my property," Kwame said simply. Something in Abigail's chest loosened slightly. "I'd like to sell you a breeding pair," she said. before the council vote. I'd like to buy one, Kwame said, and I'll be at the council meeting. He left, and she stood watching him go, and she thought that sometimes the people the valley had underestimated had a way of finding each other. Not out of sentiment, out of the specific logic of people who'd had to be right when everyone else said they were wrong. She was separating the breeding pairs the following week, a process that required knowledge of the flock's internal dynamics that she'd spent months building, which birds paired naturally, which ganders were strong and reliable, which females had the best instincts. When Agnes Hooper appeared at the fence, Agnes had not come to the fence since the day she'd watched the geese arrive and pronounce them sick. Her appearance now had the specific quality of a visit that had been decided upon, prepared for, and was therefore not casual, regardless of how casual it was trying to appear. "I hear you've been selling birds," Agnes said. "A few. To Frank Hennessy and Henry Crisp." Agnes paused. "And Kwame Okafor." "Word travels," Abigail said, which was as close as she'd come to pointing out that Pearl's post office was a significant civic institution. "My husband was talking to Calvin Drake at the mill," Agnes said. He's concerned." Abigail continued working. "He thinks you're organizing against the petition," Agnes said. "He thinks the bird sales are political." "They're commercial," Abigail said. "I'm a farm selling a product. That's not political." "Calvin doesn't see it that way." "Calvin can see it whatever way he likes." She looked up. "Agnes, what do you want?" Agnes blinked. People who came to fences with indirect intentions rarely expected the direct question, and Agnes Hooper was no exception. She regrouped. "I want to know if my husband should be worried," Agnes said, and the performative quality dropped slightly, enough that something more honest showed under it. "He signed the petition because Calvin asked him to, and Bernard doesn't know how to say no to Calvin Drake. But Bernard doesn't have any particular feeling about your geese one way or another. He's worried about being on the wrong side of something." Now that, Abigail could work with. "Bernard should probably make up his own mind," she said, "based on his own assessment of what's been good for this valley and what hasn't." She paused. "You've had any predator trouble this year?" "We lost 4 hens in April," Agnes said. "The coop was breached." "Any theft?" Agnes hesitated. "A saddle went missing from the barn in May. We thought maybe it was misplaced, but it wasn't misplaced," Abigail said. "It's June and it's still not there." Agnes's mouth tightened. "No." "Every farm in this valley that's had losses this year had one thing in common," Abigail said. "A dog that didn't bark, or a dog that got managed." She nodded toward the flock. "Nobody manages a goose. Nobody makes friends with them. Nobody knows how to keep them quiet when something's wrong." She let that sit. "Bernard should think about whether the thing that's been protecting his neighbor's farm is a nuisance or a resource." Agnes stood at the fence for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she said, "The saddle was a good one. Bernard was attached to it." "I imagine he was." Agnes left without committing to anything, which was Agnes's way, but the visit itself was information. If Bernard Hooper was reconsidering, it meant the petition's 7 signatures were softer than Drake believed. Signatures on a petition and a vote at a council meeting were 2 different things, and the distance between them could be measured in doubt. She was beginning to understand Drake's timeline. He needed the vote in July because July was before her breeding pairs could be established on other farms, before the value of a guardian flock could be demonstrated across multiple properties, before the thing she was building had enough roots that pulling it out would cost more than the community was willing to pay. If he waited until August or September, the arithmetic changed. He knew that. That was why he was moving fast. The trouble was, she needed to move faster. It was Owen who brought her the information that changed the shape of everything on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of June, and he brought it with the controlled urgency of someone who'd been sitting on it since the previous evening and had not slept well because of it. "Tom Claiborne was at our house last night," he said, "with his father." She looked up. "They weren't there to see Pa," Owen said. "Pa was just there. They were there because Pa's farm is between here and the North Road, and they wanted to, I don't know, they wanted to look at something. I don't know what." "What did they talk about?" "Robert Claiborne was talking about the council meeting, about Drake's ordinance." Owen paused. "He said if the vote doesn't go through in July, Drake is going to raise the matter differently. He said Drake has people who can make things difficult for farms that aren't cooperative with community standards. She set down what she was holding. What kind of difficult? He didn't say exactly, but Tom was smiling while he said it. Owen's jaw did that thing it did when he was controlling something. Tom Claiborne smiling about something is never good. She thought about the stone thrown into her yard, the casual testing of it, the watching to see what happened. They said anything about me specifically? Robert Claiborne called you. Owen stopped, started again. He said the council couldn't let the valley be managed by... Another stop. He used your size, he said finally, and the word charity case. He said it would set a precedent. The burn behind her sternum, again, familiar now, almost useful. She breathed through it. Owen, she said, how much of this did your father agree with? Owen looked at the ground, which told her enough. Okay, she said. I'm sorry, he said, and the word was ragged with something he hadn't entirely sorted out yet. The complicated grief of being a child who sees his parent clearly and doesn't have anywhere to put what he sees. Don't be, she said. None of this is yours to apologize for. She meant it. What is yours is what you do with what you know. He looked up. I came here, he said. Straight here, before chores, before anything. I know, she said. That's what I mean. She spent the rest of that morning thinking about Robert Claiborne and his son and what make things difficult meant in the mouth of a man who sat on the town council and whose son threw stones into women's yards. She thought about the timing, Drake's July vote, the breeding pairs she'd sold but that hadn't been established long enough to matter yet, the 7 signatures and the question of whether Bernard Hooper's had gone soft. She needed something she didn't have. She needed evidence, not of what Drake intended. Intent was hard to demonstrate to a council that was already inclined toward him, but of what was already happening, the thefts, the pattern of them. She needed the pattern to be visible to more people than just the farms that had suffered losses, and she needed it visible before July. She wrote 2 more letters that afternoon, one to Frank Hennessy, asking if he'd heard anything about the tools theft that connected it to other incidents in the valley. One to Pearl, not through the post office, but a note delivered by Owen directly to Pearl's house, asking if Pearl had heard anything about where stolen goods from the valley were ending up. Pearl, she'd come to understand, was not simply a gossip. Pearl was an information system, and information systems, if you understood their logic, could be navigated. The response from Pearl came back through Owen the next morning. Talk to Enid Marsh at the boarding house. She's had 2 men staying there since March. They pay cash. They leave odd hours. She's been meaning to mention it to someone. Abigail read that note 3 times. 2 men at Enid Marsh's boarding house. Cash. Odd hours. Since March, which was when the thefts had started. She thought about the figure that had stood at the edge of her lantern light in the dark and then walked away. She thought about someone who knew Frank Hennessy's property well enough to manage his dogs. She thought about a smokehouse breach planned around the nights when Kwame Okafor's son wasn't home. Organized, she'd said to Owen early on, not random. She put on her coat and walked to Enid Marsh's boarding house. Enid was 63, a widow of 20 years, and had the particular quality of long-term widows who've managed entirely on their own long enough that the management had become invisible to. You only saw its results. The boarding house was clean, the accounts were kept, the difficult tenants were handled. Enid had seen enough of the world to know what she was looking at, usually. I've been wondering, Enid said when Abigail sat down at her kitchen table, whether to go to the council or to someone who might actually do something. Tell me about them, Abigail said. The 2 men were named Wade and Pruitt, or at least those were the names they gave. Wade was younger, 30 or so, with the kind of watchfulness that wasn't the natural alertness of an honest man, but the constructed alertness of someone accustomed to noticing exits. Pruitt was older, quieter. They'd arrived in mid-March, said they were in the area looking at land to purchase, paid 2 months in advance in cash, and had been there ever since, looking at no land that Enid had observed. They're gone nights sometimes, Enid said. Not every night. Maybe once a week, 10 days. They come back before morning and they sleep late. She paused. And about 6 weeks ago I was cleaning the room and there was a saddle under the bed. Abigail's hands were very still on the table. A good saddle, Enid said. Leather-worked, the kind a man takes care of. Bernard Hooper's saddle went missing in May, Abigail said. Enid nodded, once, as if this confirmed something she'd already assembled. I should have gone to someone sooner, she said. But Drake is on the council, and Robert Claiborne is on the council, and these men are paying rent, and I... She stopped. I'm a woman running a business alone, you understand. I understand exactly, Abigail said. She walked home with her hands in her pockets and her mind moving fast. Wade and Pruitt in Enid Marsh's boarding house. The saddle. The pattern of the thefts. The cash. The timing. Since March, which was almost exactly when Abigail had moved onto the homestead and begun to establish herself. She didn't know yet what the connection was between Wade and Pruitt and Calvin Drake, if there was one. That might be coincidence and correlation, and the tendency of people who are frightened to see patterns that confirm their fears. She was aware of that tendency in herself and tried to account for it. But the saddle was not a pattern. The saddle was a fact. She told Frank Hennessy about it when he came to check on his breeding pair on Thursday. She told him plainly what Enid had said, what the saddle suggested, what she didn't know yet and was being careful not to assume. Frank listened without interrupting, which was the best thing about Frank Hennessy. Wade and Pruitt, he said when she finished. That's what Enid says. Cash. Since March. Frank looked at the fence for a moment. I want to go to the marshal, he said. I think you should, but not yet. She paused. If we go now, we have a woman's second-hand account of a saddle under a bed. That's not enough. And if they get spooked and run, we've got nothing for the council meeting and Drake's ordinance goes through and I lose the farm. Frank looked at her steadily. You want to wait? I want to be ready before we move. I want more before we hand it to the marshal. She met his eyes. I know it's asking something of you. It's your tools that are missing. It's more than tools, Frank said quietly. My son was in that barn 2 nights before the theft. If the timing had been different... He stopped. No, you're right. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. She hadn't expected that, the trust in it, the willingness to hold something difficult in place because a woman with good judgment had asked him to. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Let's see what July looks like. July, as it turned out, announced itself before it arrived. The council meeting notice went up on the community board outside Pearl's post office on the last day of June. Special session of the Grover's Mill Town Council, July 14th, 1891. Matters of community ordinance to be discussed. It didn't name her. It didn't need to. Everyone in the valley knew what matters of community ordinance meant. Agnes Hooper came to the fence the next morning. Bernard is going to the meeting, she said. Most people will go to the meeting, Abigail said. He's going to... Agnes paused, and something real crossed her face, something unperformed. He's thinking about withdrawing his signature from the petition. Abigail looked at her. I want to know, Agnes said, if that would make a difference to your situation. Whether it's worth the trouble it'll cause him with Calvin. Yes, Abigail said. It would make a difference. Then I'll tell him that. Agnes turned to go, then stopped. Mrs. Mercer, when you first came here, with the geese, she paused in the way of someone choosing words more carefully than usual. I said something to Martha Birch. I know what you said. Agnes's chin moved slightly. I thought you were going to fail. I thought the whole thing was absurd, Abigail offered. Yes. Agnes looked at the flock, at Hazel in her place at the east fence. I was wrong, she said. It came out flat and true and without any decoration, and Abigail understood it cost Agnes Hooper something real to say it. I know, Abigail said. Not forgiving, exactly. Not dismissing, just acknowledging the accounting. Agnes left. Owen showed up at midday, which was unusual. He was always mourning. He came through the gate without stopping at it, which was also unusual, and his face had a quality she hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled alarm, the face of someone running toward a thing rather than away from it. Tom Claiborne was on the road this morning, he said, with 2 men I didn't recognize. She set down what she was holding. They stopped at the fence. All 3 of them. Owen's voice was careful. Tom pointed at the flock. He was explaining something to the 2 men. One of them was writing things down. She thought about Wade and Pruitt at Enid's boarding house. Did you hear what he was saying? I was too far, but the man writing... Owen paused. After they left, I walked up to where they'd been standing. There was a paper on the ground. Dropped or left on purpose. I don't know. He reached into his coat and handed it to her. It was a page torn from a small notebook. On it, in a hand she didn't recognize, were written several things. A rough count of the flock size, the word East Fence with a crude directional arrow, the words Most Active Midnight 4 with a question mark, and at the bottom, separated from the rest by a line, 14. Just that. The number. She stared at the number 14. Owen was watching her face. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and stood very still for a moment, doing the specific things she'd learned to do when fear arrived. Not refusing it, not feeding it, but acknowledging it, and then setting it aside with the kind of deliberate action that left her hands free for whatever came next. Owen, she said, I need you to do something for me. Today. Right now. Yes, he said, without asking what. Frank Hennessy. Tell him what you just told me. Tell him what the paper said. She paused. Tell him we're moving on the Marshall tomorrow morning, with or without more. Owen was already pulling on his hat. And Owen, he stopped. Go home tonight. Stay home tonight. Don't come here until morning. He looked at her. I mean it, she said. Whatever happens tonight, I need you safe, and I need you able to talk tomorrow. His jaw worked. What's going to happen tonight? I don't know, she said. That's why you're going home. He stood there for a moment longer than he should have, being 14 and stubborn and genuine in the way of people who've decided where they stand. Then he nodded, once, and left at a speed that was just below running. She stood alone in her yard in the July heat, the flock spread around her, Hazel at the east fence watching the road with those gold hazel eyes that missed nothing. The paper in her pocket. The number 14. 14 was the count of breeding pairs she'd sold or agreed to sell. 14 farms in the valley that would be keeping geese before the summer was out. Someone had been tracking it. Someone had understood, as she had, that 14 was the number that made the ordinance politically impossible. Because 14 farms with guardian geese meant 14 families who would vote against an ordinance that eliminated them. Someone was trying to understand how close she was to 14. And Tom Claiborne had been on the road pointing at her flock with two strangers while one of them wrote things down. She checked every section of the fence that afternoon. She checked the pen, the water, the feed. She moved through everything methodically, doing what could be done, not thinking past what could be done, because thinking past it served nothing. At dusk, she went inside and sat at the listing stove and ate without tasting it, and watched the flock through the window as the light went out of the sky. Hazel was at the east fence, watching. The night came down over the Kansas prairie, and Abigail Mercer sat in her house with the old shotgun Thomas had left propped against the wall beside her, and she did not sleep, and she waited for what the night was going to bring. The first hour of waiting was the hardest. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened, and that was the problem. The prairie at night had its own language, a low continuous murmur of wind and grass and distant animal sound, and she'd learned enough of it over the past months to hear the difference between what belonged and what didn't. But in that first hour, sitting at the listing stove with the shotgun against the wall and the window showing her nothing but dark, every sound was the wrong kind of ambiguous. Every shift of wind in the grass was a footstep. Every creak of the house settling was something testing the fence. She moved her chair so she could see both the window facing the yard and the door at the same time. She put the lantern low, almost out. She wanted to see the yard without the light advertising that she was awake and watching, which required a specific management of brightness that she'd practiced exactly once before tonight and wasn't confident about. The flock was quiet. That was what she kept coming back to. The flock was quiet, which meant nothing was wrong yet, and she needed to trust that because the alternative was to make herself crazy, interpreting silence as threat. Hazel was at the east fence. She could make out the shape of her in the dim. The particular posture, wings slightly raised, neck not fully extended but not relaxed either. The in-between position that Abigail had come to understand as the goose equivalent of yellow alert. Not alarmed. Watching harder than usual. Something had Hazel's attention. Abigail moved to the window and put her face close to the glass without touching it, looking in the direction Hazel was facing. The road was dark. The sky was overcast, no moon, which was the kind of night that suited people with reasons to move without being seen. She waited. The second hour was easier because she'd made her peace with not sleeping, and the body adjusted to what the mind accepted. She thought about the paper in her coat pocket, the number 14. She thought about Tom Claiborne, pointing at the flock with two strangers beside him, one of them writing things down. She thought about Wade and Pruitt at Enid's boarding house, paying cash, coming and going at odd hours, a good saddle under the bed. She thought about what Drake stood to gain from eliminating the Geese before the council vote, and then she thought past that, into territory she hadn't let herself examine too directly, because looking at it straight on required acknowledging how organized this was. If Wade and Pruitt were connected to Drake, and she didn't know that, she was being careful not to know things she couldn't prove, then the thefts weren't random criminal opportunism. They were pressure. Make the valley feel unsafe, make the farms feel vulnerable, position Drake as the community leader who could restore order, and eliminate the one voice saying that the farms could protect themselves without his help. She was the counter-argument to his authority. That was why he needed her gone. She was still working through this when Hazel erupted. Not the coyote alarm, not the person at the fence alarm. This was different. This was every alarm at once, layered and simultaneous. The full flock response that she'd only heard once before in a brief test during a thunderstorm. And it was so immediate and total that she was on her feet with the shotgun in her hand before the first full second of it had passed. She went to the door and stopped. She did not go outside. She stood at the door with her hand on the latch, and she listened to the direction of the alarm, because direction mattered. Hazel communicated direction with everything, her body position, the angle of her head, the specific character of the sound. South fence. And underneath the alarm, underneath the geese, she heard something else. A sound she couldn't immediately name. A rushing quality, a crackling. Not footsteps. Not the wind. She opened the door. The south was lit, not her south fence. Further, the Bellard place to the west and slightly south. Jim Bellard's main granary, the large one he'd built 3 seasons ago with the new lumber, the one he'd told her held the better part of his stored winter grain. It was lit from inside, the light wrong, too orange, too moving, spilling from the gaps in the boards in a way that light from a lantern didn't spill. Fire. The word hit her, and she was already moving, out the door and across the yard, the flock screaming around her, Hazel at the south fence facing the direction of the fire with every feather raised. Abigail got to the south fence and looked and could see it clearly now. The Bellard granary burning, the fire established enough that the roof line showed orange against the black sky, and moving against the orange, shadows. 2 of them, maybe 3, moving fast and low away from the fire toward the north road. Moving toward the north road, which meant moving toward the Claiborne mill, which meant moving away from where they'd come from. She had the shotgun. She was at her south fence, a quarter mile from a burning building, and the people who'd started that fire were running across open ground between her property and the road. She did not fire. She made that decision in less than a second. She was not going to fire a shotgun into the dark at shadows, not at this range, not at targets she couldn't identify with certainty. She was not built for that kind of mistake, and she knew it. What she did instead was shoot into the air, once. The sound of it went out across the prairie like a hand slapping a table, loud enough to wake every sleeping person within half a mile. The shadows running toward the road stopped moving. Then they moved faster. Abigail turned and ran back to the house and did the thing she'd never done before, the thing she'd been thinking about since she moved onto this land and understood what isolated meant in the specific geography of the Kansas prairie. She went to the barn and she screamed. Not a word, just sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they're telling the darkness that something is wrong and they need it to be heard. She screamed 3 times, as loud as she could produce, in the direction of the Barrett farm to the east because the Barretts were closest. Then she ran toward the Bellard granary. She was not built for running. She knew this, had always known it. Her body was not a body that ran efficiently, and the quarter mile across the uneven ground in the dark cost her more than she wanted it to, her breathing ragged and her side aching by the time she reached the granary. But she ran. She ran the way you run when the alternative is standing still while something burns. Jim Bellard was already outside. He'd gotten there before her, his house being closer to the granary than her property was, and he was standing with a bucket in each hand looking at a fire that was past the point where buckets would answer it. His wife Martha was behind him with another bucket, and their oldest son, who was 16, was throwing dirt at the base of the south wall with a shovel, which was doing approximately nothing but was at least doing something. "Jim," Abigail said. He turned. He looked at the shotgun in her hand and at her face, and he said, "You saw them." "Two, maybe three, running for the north road." She was still catching her breath. "I fired into the air. They were moving fast when I lost them." Jim looked at the granary. The roof was going. The grain inside would be ash by morning. She could smell it already, the particular smell of stored grain burning, nothing else like it. His face was doing something she recognized from the inside, the specific expression of a person watching a significant piece of their future turn to smoke and trying to manage it in real time. "The horses," she said. "Did you get the horses out?" "Yes." He said it mechanically. "Before I came here." "Yes." She looked at the north wall of the granary. The fire hadn't reached it fully yet. "Is there anything in there we can save?" "Not worth dying for," Martha said from behind them, which was exactly the right answer and took a certain kind of steadiness to say. The Barrett farm was lit up now. She could see the lights from here, the house windows bright, which meant her screaming had done what she'd meant it to do. And beyond the Barretts, further north, she could see the Hennessy place beginning to show lights, which meant either the gunshot or the glow of the fire had reached them. People were going to come. That was the Prairie. Whatever else could be said about it. People came when something burned. She stood with Jim Bellard while his granary went and thought about the shadows running toward the north road and tried to separate what she'd actually seen from what she thought she'd seen. Two figures, moving with the purposeful speed of people with a plan. One had been taller, the other had run slightly differently, a hitch in the left stride that she'd registered without registering. She knew that hitch. She'd seen it before, at her south fence on a Tuesday afternoon, when Tom Claiborne and his companions had stood at her fence and one of them had written things down. Not Tom. Tom moved without the hitch. She'd watched him walk away and cataloged the walk without knowing she was cataloging it. But one of the men with Tom, the one who hadn't been writing. She held that thought very carefully. She held it the way you hold something fragile, present, real, but requiring care because she was not going to say it out loud until she was certain enough to be accountable for saying it. Frank Hennessy arrived 15 minutes later, his horse hard-ridden, Owen Barrett running beside the horse on foot, in the way of a boy who'd left before the horse was saddled. Owen had not gone home and stayed there the way she'd told him to, which meant he'd either decided the situation overrode her instruction or that she'd been right about what the night might bring, and he wasn't going to be somewhere else when it arrived. She didn't know whether to be angry about this. She decided to be not angry about it and revisit the question later. Owen came straight to her, not Jim, not Frank. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face the way you look at someone you've been worried about, checking for damage, and something in that look, the specific quality of it, 14 years old and terrified and trying not to show it, put a crack in the controlled surface she'd been maintaining since the alarm. She did not let the crack show. She did not have time for it. "You all right?" Owen said. "Fine," she said. "I told you to stay home." "I heard the shot," he said. "I know. And the—" He stopped. "You screamed." "I know what I did, Owen." He looked at the granary, at the fire doing what fires do when they're past stopping, and his jaw worked. "It's Wade," he said, quietly enough that only she heard it. "The man from the boarding house. He has a bad left knee. I've seen him twice in town, and both times I noticed the way he walked." She stared at him. "I was going to tell you in the morning," he said. "I saw him in town 3 days ago, and I knew his name from what you'd told me about Enid's boarding house, and I recognized the way he walked." He paused. "I should have told you right away. I don't know why I waited. I think I was—" He stopped. "I was trying to be sure." "Wade," she said, just to have the name out loud, attached to the thing she'd seen. "Yes." Frank Hennessy was beside them now. She told him what Owen had said, and told him about the hitch in the walk she'd observed from the south fence. Frank listened with his arms folded and the firelight moving on his face. "Marshall Dern lives 8 miles north," Frank said when she finished. "I can ride there in an hour." "Go," she said. Frank looked at Jim Bellard, standing with his buckets watching what was left of his granary. "Jim," he said, "I'm sorry for this." Jim didn't look up. "Go get the marshal," he said. "That's what helps me now." Frank rode north at a hard gallop, and the remaining people, Abigail, Owen, Martha Bellard, Jim, and 3 more neighbors who'd arrived from the south in the past few minutes, stood in the field and watched the granary burn itself down to its bones. The Okafor family arrived just after midnight, Kwame driving his wagon with Celestine beside him and 2 of his sons in the bed. He took one look at the granary and one look at Abigail and said, "What do you need?" "We need the marshal, and we've sent for him," she said. "We need someone to check the north road. There may be tracks, and they'll be gone by morning if the weather turns." Kwame's older son was already climbing down from the wagon. He was 20, broad-shouldered, and had the specific expression of a young man who's been told what direction the problem went. He looked at Kwame, who nodded once, and then he and his brother went north along the road without being asked for anything further. It was 1 in the morning when the granary finished. What remained was the skeleton of it, the main posts and part of the north wall. Everything else collapsed inward on itself. Jim Bellard sat down in the grass at some point, just sat down in the middle of a field at 1 in the morning, and Martha sat beside him and put her hand on his arm, and Abigail looked away because some things weren't for watching. She walked back to her fence alone. The flock was still agitated. She could hear them from a distance, the sustained alert state that came after a major alarm, the flock unable to fully stand down because the threat was still in the air, even if the immediate moment had passed. She went in through the gate and moved through the yard, and the birds parted for her and resettled around her in the way they'd developed over months. Not friendly, not affectionate, but calibrated to her presence the way any working thing calibrates to the person it works alongside. Hazel was at the south fence now, facing the direction of the granary. Her wings were still slightly raised. "I know," Abigail said. It wasn't a word she'd normally say to a bird, but it was 1 in the morning, and she was alone, and the feeling coming up through the controlled surface was complicated enough that saying something to Hazel was the option with the least consequence. She checked the fence, she checked the pen, she checked the water. She did all of this mechanically, in the dark, by touch and routine, and somewhere in the middle of checking the pen. She let herself think about the granary, Jim Bellard's granary, full of grain that had taken a season to grow and store, gone in 3 hours. And the specific fury of it moved through her clean and total, and then settled into something harder and more useful. They had miscalculated. Whoever had planned this, whether it was Wade and Pruitt operating independently, or something more connected that she still couldn't prove, they had miscalculated the same way people always miscalculated when they looked at her property. They'd looked at an isolated farm, a woman alone, and assumed that a fire in a neighboring granary would register as threat and not as evidence. They'd assumed she'd watched the fire from her fence the way frightened people watched fires, staying back, doing nothing useful. They hadn't accounted for what 39 geese with exceptional hearing would do at midnight when something was wrong to the south. They hadn't accounted for the fact that she'd been waiting. Marshal Dern arrived at 2:30 with Frank Hennessy and a deputy who looked young enough to make Abigail briefly reconsider the reliability of the legal system. But Dern himself was solid. She'd expected someone Drake had in his pocket, and instead found a man of about 50 who'd clearly ridden 8 miles at speed and was both tired and alert and asking the right questions. He heard her account first, at her fence, while the deputy took notes and Owen stood nearby being studiously invisible. She told him everything in order: the alarm, the direction, the figures running, the shot she'd fired into the air, the hitch in the left stride, Owen's identification of Wade from the boarding house. She told him about Enid Marsh and the saddle under the bed. She told him about the string of thefts since March, the pattern she'd observed, the cash payments. Dern listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You fired 1 shot into the air," he said. "Yes." "Not at the figures." "No." "Why not?" "Because I couldn't identify them with certainty, and I wasn't willing to shoot a person in the dark on the basis of a shadow." She paused. "And because the sound would wake the valley better than anything else I had." Dern looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Smart," he said finally. Not impressed exactly, more like marking an assessment in a column. "Marshal," she said, "Drake's ordinance vote is in 13 days. If this investigation runs past July 14th, I know about the ordinance," Dern said. "I also know the law doesn't run on council meeting schedules, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not asking it to. I'm telling you the timeline because it's relevant to why tonight happened." Dern looked at her. "You think the fire is connected to the vote?" I think the fire is connected to a pattern of organized theft that's been running in this valley since March. And I think that pattern has an interest in this valley being frightened rather than protected. She kept her voice even. Whether Drake is connected to that pattern is something I don't know and can't prove. But the timing of the fire. One night before I was planning to go to you with the information about Enid's boarding house. That's not a coincidence I know how to explain. Dern was quiet for a long moment. Enid Marsh, he said. She'll tell me what she told you? She's been wanting to tell someone for months, Abigail said. Go talk to her. He went. Frank Hennessy went with him. Abigail stayed at her property because someone needed to, and Owen stayed because he was going to stay regardless of what she said about it. The Okafor boys came back from the North Road at 3:30 with mud on their boots and two things, a set of fresh tracks leading off the road into the creek bed, and a piece of cloth caught on the creekside brush that had been torn from something. Dark wool, with a distinctive cross-stitched mending at one edge. Owen took one look at the cloth and went still. Owen, Abigail said. He picked it up carefully. He held it in the lantern light and looked at it for a long time. Tom Claiborne has a dark wool coat, he said, with mending like this on the right cuff. He paused. His mother does the mending. I've been to their house. Another pause. 3 times. She looked at him. He was looking at the cloth with an expression that she understood, the specific expression of someone who has suspected something and is now holding the proof of it, and is experiencing the fact that being right about something terrible is not satisfying in the way being right is supposed to be. It might not be his, she said. It was the honest thing to say, even now. It might not be, Owen agreed. His voice was controlled. But it is. She held the cloth while Owen went to find Kwame, and she stood in the dark at her south fence and thought about Robert Claiborne's son throwing a stone into her yard and watching what happened. Testing. Watching. The appetite she'd identified early on, the quality of a person who does things to see what they'll be allowed to do. This was where that led. At 4 a.m, while the remaining people from the Bellard fire were starting to drift home with the specific exhausted silence of people who've been through something and need to sleep before they can process it, Jim Bellard came to Abigail's fence. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just leaned on the fence the way very tired men lean on things, using the structure as extension of himself. My winter stores, he said finally. I know. I've got enough in the house larder and what's in the kitchen garden to get through maybe 2 months into fall. He paused. After that, I'd be looking at buying grain at full summer price, which... He stopped. I did the numbers wrong for this year already. I can't afford to do them more wrong. She thought about the tobacco tin above the stove. She thought about 12 breeding pairs sold. She thought about egg money and the coming wheat yield. You'll have the wheat, she said. Your winter wheat same as mine. Some of it, he said. Not all. Not enough. She looked at the east fence where Hazel was back to her baseline position. The long night's alarm settled into watchfulness. She thought about lists. She thought about what she had and what was needed and what the arithmetic said. Jim, she said, I have a proposal. He looked at her. You take a breeding pair. I'll price them to you at half what I charged Frank Hennessy. In exchange, you store your remaining fall harvest in my barn. She paused. My barn is guarded. What's in it doesn't get touched. You've seen that. Jim was quiet for a long moment. A complicated quiet. She could see him working through it, the arithmetic and the pride and the practical reality of the pride fighting the arithmetic. That's charitable, he said finally. No, it's not, she said. Your harvest in my barn means I have grain on the property that reduces what I need to buy from Pearl's husband through the winter. It benefits both of us. He looked at her. You came up with that just now? I've been coming up with things like that for 8 months, she said. It's what I do instead of sleeping. He almost, not quite, smiled. Half price, he said. Half price. And I come check on my own harvest whenever I need to. Anytime you like. Jim Bellard nodded once, the same way Frank Hennessy nodded when he'd decided something. All right, he said. He walked back toward his property, toward the skeleton of the granary still showing orange at its base in the first gray suggestion of dawn, And Abigail watched him go and thought that there was a specific kind of thing that happened when catastrophe was also not opportunity, that was the wrong word, when catastrophe was also a reorganization, when the thing that destroyed also revealed new structures that the old arrangements had prevented. She went inside as the sky began to lighten, and she sat at the listing stove and she did not sleep. She made a list. She put down what the night had yielded. Dern going to Enid Marsh, the tracks at the creek, the cloth with the mended cuff, Owen's identification of Wade, Jim Bellard's verbal agreement, Quaim Okafor's sons in the field at midnight. She put down what she still didn't have. A direct connection between Drake and the men at the boarding house. A witness who'd seen Tom Claiborne at the granary. Wade and Pruitt in custody. She put down what 13 days meant. The council meeting was July 14th. Today was the 1st of July. 13 days to let Dern work. To let the arrests happen or not happen. To let the valley process what the night had revealed. 13 days for Drake's ordinance to either gain or lose the ground it needed. She was still at the stove when Owen knocked at the door at 6:15, the habitual time, the time that had its own logic regardless of what the night had been. She let him in. He sat down across from her at the table without being asked, which was new. He'd never come inside before, always stayed at the gate or in the yard. He sat in Thomas's chair, the one she'd kept but stopped using, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at her. "My father is going to hear about last night," Owen said. "Everyone's going to hear about last night. He's going to hear Tom Claiborne's name attached to it." He paused. "He signed Drake's petition because Calvin Drake asked him to, and because my father doesn't like saying no to men like Calvin Drake." He was choosing words very carefully, the same way he'd been careful about the cloth. "But my father is not a man who'd stay quiet about a granary fire if he knew who set it." She looked at him. "I'm not saying he'll help you," Owen said. "I'm not promising something I can't deliver. I'm saying his name on that petition. It's going to feel different to him today than it did last week." "Maybe," she said. "I know my father better than you do." "I know." "He's a complicated man," Owen said, in the voice of someone making peace with a thing they haven't finished making peace with. "He's not—" a pause. "He's not all bad." "I know that too," she said. Owen looked at his hands on the table. "I think he might come talk to you," he said. "After he hears. I think he might." He looked up. "I don't want you to be unkind to him if he does." She thought about the laugh in the feed store. The laugh she hadn't seen but could construct perfectly from what Owen had told her, the way you construct something you've seen 100 versions of. "I'll be fair to him," she said. "That's what I can promise." Owen nodded. He stood up. He looked at Thomas's chair for a moment, then at her, then at the door. "Go get some sleep," she said. "Come back this afternoon." "I'll come back this morning," he said. "Owen." "I'll come back this morning," he said again, without any inflection, as if it were simply a statement of fact rather than an argument, which was how Owen Barrett won arguments. He just continued stating the thing as fact until the argument became unnecessary. He left, and she sat alone at the listing stove in the early July morning with the flock settling into their daytime routines outside the window. And she thought about 13 days, and Wade and Pruitt, and a piece of dark wool caught on creekside brush, and Jim Bellard sitting down in a field at 1 in the morning, and Frank Hennessy riding 8 miles in the dark to get the marshal. She thought about the granary burning. She thought about what it cost a man like Jim Bellard to lean on a fence at 4 in the morning and let a woman he'd laughed at make a proposal. She thought about Thomas, who had talked about this land for 3 years and not lived to see what she'd made of it. Then she put Thomas away, the way she always had to eventually, because she couldn't do what needed doing and carry him at the same time. And she looked at her list, and she thought about what 13 days required. Outside, Hazel was at the east fence, watching the road. The light was coming up thin and yellow over the Kansas prairie, and the morning was already hot, and somewhere 8 miles north, Marshal Dern was knocking on Enid Marsh's door with questions about 2 men who paid cash and came home late. And 13 days sat between Abigail Mercer and a council meeting that was going to determine whether everything she'd built on this exhausted 11 acres got to keep existing. She was not optimistic. She was not pessimistic either. She was awake, and she was making her list, and the flock was at their stations. That was enough to start. Marshal Dern arrested Wade and Pruitt on the morning of July 3rd. Abigail heard about it from Owen, who heard about it from Pearl, who had apparently been at her post office window at the precise moment Dern and his deputy walked the two men down the main street of Grover's Mill in the direction of the county jail. Pearl's account, as relayed through Owen, included the detail that Wade had walked with a pronounced hitch in his left knee and had not looked at anyone on the street, while Pruitt had looked at everyone, the way people look when they're calculating odds. Enid Marsh had given Dern the saddle. She'd kept it, had not moved it from under the bed where she'd found it, which showed a presence of mind that Abigail deeply respected. The saddle was identified by Bernard Hooper, whose name on Drake's petition had apparently been withdrawn 3 days prior, before the granary fire, before any of this, which meant Agnes Hooper had done what she'd said she would do, and Bernard had done what Agnes had asked, and Abigail found herself unexpectedly grateful for the specific domestic machinery of the Hooper household. The cloth from the creek brush proved harder. Tom Claiborne denied it was his coat, and his mother, who had in fact done the mending, the distinctive cross-stitch being hers, said under questioning from Dern that she couldn't be certain which of the dark coats in the house that piece had come from. This was the kind of answer that was technically true and practically a lie, and everyone including Dern understood what it was. But understanding and proving were different jurisdictions, and Tom Claiborne remained, for the moment, unindicted. Robert Claiborne went to Drake's office the morning after the arrests. She knew this because Kwame Okafor's older son had seen him go in and had the presence of mind to note the time, 9 in the morning, and the length of the visit, 40 minutes, and the quality of Robert Claiborne's face when he came out, which the Okafor boy described as a man who had been told something he didn't want to hear and was now deciding whether to believe it. The question of what Drake had told Robert Claiborne about Wade and Pruitt, whether he'd claimed ignorance, whether he'd distanced himself, whether he'd thrown them entirely to the law and stepped back, that was a question Abigail could not answer and stopped trying to answer, because it lived in the space between what she could know and what she needed to know. And she'd learned the hard way that that space was where you wasted energy you couldn't afford to waste. She had 10 days until July 14th. She used them. She went to see Jim Bellard and helped him assess what remained of the granary and what could be salvaged from the site. The answer was not much. The lumber was ash, the stored grain was ash, but they salvaged the iron fittings and the door hardware, which had a resale value, and Abigail spent 2 afternoons helping Jim's son stack and sort it, which she did without being asked and without making anything of it. Jim watched this from a distance the first afternoon, and the second afternoon he came and worked beside her, and they worked without talking much, the way people work when the working is the communication. She went to see Pearl and asked her plainly what the valley was saying. Pearl told her plainly, which was the thing about Pearl that made her valuable. Under the management of information, she was actually accurate, if you asked the right question directly enough. The valley was saying several things at once, which was what valleys did. It was saying that the arrests had changed something, that the fire had changed something, that the petition felt different now than it had 2 weeks ago. It was also saying that Calvin Drake was still Calvin Drake, that he still had money and influence and the specific gravity of a man who'd been powerful in one place for a long time. And that gravity didn't disappear because 2 men got walked down Main Street in daylight. "Is he going to withdraw the ordinance?" Abigail asked. Pearl considered this with genuine seriousness. "No," she said. "He's going to let the vote happen. He's calculated that he still wins." "Does he?" Pearl looked at her steadily. "I think it's close," she said. "I think it depends on who shows up and what they say." Abigail nodded and went home. She spent the evening of July 13th the way she'd spent the evening of that first night in March, sitting at the listing stove, going through the numbers. The breeding pairs. She had 11 placed, with 2 more pending, which was not the 14 she'd been working toward, but was 11 farms in the valley with guardian geese, 11 families with a direct material interest in the outcome of tomorrow's vote. She had Jim Bellard's verbal agreement, Frank Hennessy's public support, Kwame Okafor, who had said flatly that he'd be at the meeting. She had Bernard Hooper's withdrawn signature. She had Pearl's honest assessment that it was close. What she didn't have was the direct connection between Drake and the thefts that would have changed close into certain. Wade and Pruitt were in county jail, and Dern had questioned them separately for 2 full days, and neither had given Drake's name. Whether that was because Drake wasn't connected or because the distance between Drake and what happened had been constructed carefully enough to survive questioning, she didn't know. Dern didn't know. Or if Dern suspected, he hadn't said so to her. She made her list. She looked at it. She put it away. She went to bed and lay there for a while, not sleeping, which was her usual condition before significant things. She thought about Thomas, the way she sometimes let herself think about him when the guard was down. Not with grief exactly, more with the specific missing of a person who'd known her particular combination of qualities and not found them strange. Thomas would have found the Geese funny. He would have found the whole operation funny in the way he found things funny, quietly, with appreciation for the absurdity of the world arranging itself this way. She fell asleep sometime after midnight and woke at 5 with the flock quiet and Hazel visible at the east fence through the window, doing what she always did. She got up, made a list, and got dressed. The Grover's Mill Town Hall was a one-room building that smelled permanently of sawdust and the particular mustiness of a space that was used rarely enough that it couldn't air itself out between occasions. It held, at capacity, perhaps 60 people standing. By the time Abigail arrived at 9 in the morning, the meeting was called for 9:30, there were already 30 people inside and a dozen more coming down the road. Owen was at the door. He was not supposed to be at the door. He was 14 and this was a civic proceeding and she'd told him twice that he didn't need to come, which had produced the same result as every other time she'd told him something he'd decided not to do. He was standing at the door with his hat in his hands and his back straight, which was new. The back usually had some 14-year-old uncertainty in it, but today it was straight. "Your father here?" she asked. "Inside," Owen said. "Second row." She went in. The room had organized itself along the lines of informal allegiance, the way rooms at contentious meetings always did. She could read it in 30 seconds. Drake's people were on the left side, 7 or 8 of them, men whose business or social lives were intertwined enough with his that their presence was obligatory. Frank Hennessy was on the right, with Dora beside him, and Kwame Okafor was standing against the back wall with his older son, and Henry Crisp was in the 3rd row looking uncomfortable in the specific way of people who've made a decision and aren't sure yet how it'll land. She saw Robert Claiborne. He was sitting alone, not on either side, in the back corner, which told her he'd made no public decision yet and was reserving the right to make it in the room. She saw Calvin Drake. He was at the front, speaking to one of the council members in the easy manner of a man on his own territory. And when he saw her come in, he turned back to the council member without changing his expression, which was its own kind of statement. She found a place to stand against the right wall, near Frank Hennessy's row, but not in it, because she needed to be visible without being theatrical, and there was a difference. Daniel Marsh, no relation to Enid, called the meeting to order. He was the council chair, 60s, a fair man in the specific sense of a man who wasn't Drake, and wasn't Drake's opponent and tried to run things by the rules, which in a room like this one was itself a form of courage. Drake presented the ordinance first, because he'd been given the floor first, because he was Calvin Drake, and the council's procedural habits had been shaped by 20 years of him being the person who spoke first. He was measured. He was reasonable. He talked about community standards and the disruption of nighttime noise and the concerns of families with children and the question of whether one person's enterprise should impose costs on the community without consent. He did not mention her weight. He did not mention Thomas. He did not say anything that could be quoted back at him as personal. He had decided, she understood, that the personal approach had cost him something in the weeks since the feed store, and he'd recalibrated. He was good at this. She'd known he was good at this. A man didn't maintain the kind of influence Drake had maintained without being good at this. When he finished, Daniel Marsh asked if there were responses. Frank Hennessy stood up. Frank talked about the tools. He talked about what organized theft had cost his farm, and he talked about what an established guardian flock had meant in the 3 weeks since he'd acquired a breeding pair. And he talked about these things in the flat practical language of a farmer accounting for his own operation. He didn't editorialize. He didn't appeal to anything except the arithmetic. Henry Crisp stood up next, unexpected enough that a few heads turned. Henry was not a public speaker. She'd never heard him speak at a meeting in the months she'd been in the valley. And his standing had the quality of a man doing something that cost him and doing it anyway. He talked about the hogs. He talked about the dog that hadn't barked. He said that in 30 years of farming this valley, he'd lost more in 4 months to predators and theft than in any prior year, and that the only farm he knew of that hadn't lost anything was the one everyone had been laughing at. He sat down looking slightly stunned by his own participation. Kwame Okafor spoke from the back of the room without moving from the wall. He didn't raise his voice. He said that the night of the Bellard fire, his sons had been in the field at 1 in the morning helping track the people responsible, and that the alarm that had woken the valley that night had come from one property's flock, and every dog in the valley had slept through it. He said he'd like the council to consider what that meant about what the valley's existing protective arrangements were actually providing. There was a silence after that. Drake spoke again. He acknowledged the thefts, expressed sympathy for the losses, suggested that the appropriate response was improved coordination with the marshal rather than reliance on a private operation. He was careful and organized, and Abigail watched him and thought about water and dams. Daniel Marsh said, "Mrs. Mercer, do you want to speak to this?" She'd prepared something. She'd written it out 3 times and memorized the shape of it and then thrown it away, because prepared speeches in rooms like this one had a quality that worked against them. They sounded like speeches, which reminded people that they were being persuaded, which activated resistance. She said, "I bought 39 sick geese in March because I couldn't afford a dog, and I couldn't afford a hired hand, and I couldn't afford to have what I was building taken from me." She paused. "I didn't know they were going to protect half the valley. I thought they were going to protect 11 acres and 1 woman." Another pause. "They turned out to be more than I knew." She stopped there because there was nothing else that needed saying. The room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Robert Claiborne stood up. Every head in the room turned. Abigail watched Drake's face, which went through something fast and controlled before settling back into neutrality. Robert Claiborne was not comfortable standing in that room any more than Henry Crisp had been. He was a man who operated in private, in offices, in the kind of conversations that happened between 2 people who'd already decided what the outcome would be. Standing in a public room was not his preferred mode. His discomfort was visible, and he did not try to hide it, which, unexpectedly, gave him a credibility he wouldn't have had if he'd hidden it. "My son," he said. He stopped. "There's an investigation ongoing, and I'm not going to speak to that." He paused again. "But I'm going to say that the night of the Bellard fire, if there had been a guardian flock on the Bellard property or on the properties adjacent, what happened might have been stopped before it became what it became." He looked at the floor for a moment. "That's all I'm going to say." He sat down. Drake looked at Robert Claiborne for 3 seconds with an expression that Robert Claiborne did not acknowledge, because Robert Claiborne had stopped looking at Calvin Drake. Daniel Marsh called the vote. She didn't count heads. She couldn't from where she was standing. She watched faces instead, which told her more. The small decisions being made in the moment before hands went up, the particular expression of people choosing which version of themselves to be in a public room on a Tuesday morning in July. The ordinance failed. 6 against, 4 in favor, 2 abstentions. The room made noise, not celebration, nothing that clean, but a release of held breath. The collective exhale of people who'd been waiting to see which way something fell. Drake sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and looked at the middle distance and said nothing. Abigail stood against the right wall and felt the thing she'd expected to feel, which was not triumph. Triumph was for people who'd had an easy road and arrived at a clear finish line. What she felt was more complicated than that, a kind of grim relief, a recognition that a specific threat had been moved, that she'd bought time, that the work was still the work, and tomorrow she'd be up at 5 and checking the flock and going through the numbers. Frank Hennessy caught her eye from across the room and nodded once. She nodded back. Kwame Okafor was already at the door. She was about to follow when she saw Owen's father. Harold Barrett was a large man, florid, not physically intimidating so much as occupying a lot of space in every room he was in. He'd been in the left side of the room when she'd come in, not Drake's side exactly, but adjacent. And now he was standing in the middle aisle looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face, which was to say an expression without any performance in it. He walked toward her. The room was still moving and talking around them, people filing out, Drake speaking in a low voice to the one council member still at the table. And Harold Barrett came and stood in front of Abigail Mercer and worked his hat in his hands the same way Owen always worked his hat, which she'd noticed before but never said anything about. "My boy," he said. He stopped. She waited. "He's been coming to your farm every morning," Harold said. "I know that. I've known it." "Yes," she said. "I told him once to stop." Harold looked at his hat. He didn't. "No," she said. He's 14, Harold said, which contained a whole range of things that fathers say about sons they don't entirely know how to talk to. She thought about what Owen had asked her. I don't want you to be unkind to him if he does come. And she'd promised fair, not kind, because fair was what she could control. Your son is exceptional, she said, not because he came to my farm, because he has the specific quality of person who makes decisions based on what he actually sees rather than what he's expected to see. She paused. That's not common. You should know you raised someone with that in him. Harold Barrett looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who received things gracefully. She could see that, the difficulty of it moving across his face. I signed the petition, he said. I know. I shouldn't have. No, she said. You shouldn't have. He absorbed this without flinching, which surprised her slightly. He can keep coming, Harold said. My boy, if you'll have him. I'll have him, she said. Harold nodded, put his hat on, and walked out of the town hall without looking back. And Abigail stood in the emptying room and thought that there were people you could not fully forgive and could not fully condemn, and Harold Barrett was in that category. And the category was larger than most people admitted. Calvin Drake left without speaking to her. She hadn't expected him to, and he didn't. He walked out with the council member at his shoulder and the particular posture of a man rearranging his public face for the street, and she let him go because he was not a finished problem. Men like Drake didn't become finished problems. But he was a contained one, for now, in this valley, with the arithmetic against him in a way it hadn't been in July. Owen was outside the door. He'd heard enough through the open windows to know the outcome. She could tell that from his face, which was doing the thing of not doing anything, the controlled neutrality that meant he was feeling something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. 6-4, she said. He nodded. Your father spoke to me, she said. Something moved across Owen's face, fast. What did he say? That you can keep coming. She paused. He said it like it cost him something. Owen looked away toward the road. His jaw moved slightly. It probably did, he said, in the voice of someone learning to account for a complicated person without either excusing them or dismissing them, which was a hard skill at 14 or any other age. They walked back to the farm together, not talking much, the July heat pressing down on the prairie in the way it had all month, relentless and indifferent. The road was dry, the grass on either side the particular scorched gold of a Kansas summer, the sky overhead, the kind of blue that didn't care about what happened underneath it. When they got to the gate, Hazel was at the east fence. Owen stopped and looked at her for a moment. The general? Hazel. The big gray goose who'd been watching the road since March, who'd never once decided things were safe because they'd been safe yesterday, who'd sounded the alarm that woke a valley on the night something burned. She doesn't know it's over, Owen said. It's not over for her, Abigail said. She doesn't do over. She just does now. Owen looked at the goose for another moment. That's a hard way to live, he said. It's the only way she knows, Abigail said. And it's the reason we're both still here. They went through the gate, and the flock moved and settled around them, the way it always did, and Abigail picked up the feed bucket from where it always sat, and Owen picked up the rake from where he always put it, and they went to work. The summer moved forward. Wade was convicted in September of theft and arson. The granary fire proved connectable to him through the creek tracks and a witness, a farmhand from the north end of the valley who'd seen Wade near the Bellard property on the night in question and come forward after the arrest, which was how witnesses often came forward after the risk of doing so became smaller than the weight of not doing so. Pruitt pled to a lesser charge and gave enough information in the process to confirm that the two of them had been operating in the valley independently, hired by no one they'd name, which was a statement that everyone understood and that Dern noted in his file with the particular neutrality of a marshal who was not finished looking. Tom Claiborne was never charged. The cloth was inconclusive, legally, and his mother's statement had created enough ambiguity that the case couldn't be built. He left the valley in October, went east, the story went, to work in his uncle's business. And Robert Claiborne did not speak publicly about his departure. Abigail thought about Tom Claiborne sometimes, about the stone thrown into her yard, about the appetite she'd identified and what it became in a person who was never made to account for it. She hoped she was wrong about what it became. She didn't think she was. Drake remained in Grover's mill. He remained on the commercial street and at the council meetings and at the feed store where he had always been. He did not speak to Abigail directly again. She did not seek him out. The ordinance was dead and he didn't raise it again, which she understood was not a change of heart, but a change of arithmetic. The 11 breeding pairs across the valley had become, by October, 16 and 16 families with guardian geese, was a number Drake could do the math on as well as she could. Jim Bellard stored his fall harvest in her barn. He started building a new granary in August, on the north side of his property this time, with better sight lines from the farmhouse. He brought her a portion of the wheat yield in September as partial payment for the storage, arriving at the fence with the grain loaded in the back of his wagon and the specific expression of a man who has thought about something and decided what it means. "You saved my farm," he said. "I gave you a storage arrangement," she said, "and a breeding pair at half price." "That's what I said," Jim said, and there was something almost like humor in it, dry and worn down enough to be real. Frank Hennessy's breeding pair produced a clutch in September. He wrote her a note, 3 lines, which was Frank at his most expansive, saying that the flock had raised an alarm in August on 2 separate nights, that he'd investigated both times and found on the first occasion a coyote at the east fence, and on the second occasion 2 men he didn't recognize moving across his north field at 2 in the morning, who had left at a fast walk when he'd appeared with a lantern. He wrote that he thought the second pair should have been more alarmed than they apparently were, and that he was going to build a second pen in the spring. She read that letter 3 times. Owen turned 15 in October, which he mentioned only because she asked. He'd started reading in the evenings, not just farm records and accounts, but books, whatever he could get from the lending shelf at Pearl's post office. He read slowly and carefully, the way he did most things, and sometimes he'd bring a question to the farm in the morning that had clearly been with him since the night before, turning over in his mind until he had it in a shape he could ask. One morning in November, cold enough now that their breath showed in the air, he asked, "Did you always know it was going to work?" She considered this honestly. "No," she said. "There were nights I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, and I was going to be proved right about it in the spring, and everyone who'd laughed was going to be proved right too." Owen thought about this. "But you kept going." "I kept going." "Why?" She looked at Hazel, at the east fence, at the road. The November light was low and flat, the prairie gone gray and amber, the sky the color of old pewter, the way it had been the day she drove back from the Dooley place with 39 sick geese in the back of a borrowed wagon and every cent she owned gone. "Because quitting was certain," she said, "and continuing was only uncertain." She paused. "Uncertain is better. Every time." Owen looked at the flock, at Hazel, at the road beyond the fence. He was quiet for a long moment. "My father asked me last night what I want to do," he said. "With my life. When I'm grown." She waited. "I told him I wanted to farm," Owen said. "He said that was a hard life and a poor one, and he'd expected more from me." She thought about what to say. She thought about Harold Barrett working his hat, and the complication of a person who was more than his worst moments but couldn't quite get clear of them. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd rather be poor at something I understand than comfortable at something I don't." Owen paused. He didn't say anything after that. "That's a good answer," she said. "I got it from watching you," he said. Not flattering, just accounting, the way Owen always accounted for things. She didn't respond to that. She picked up the feed bucket. But she thought about it all morning, and she was still thinking about it in the afternoon when she sat at the listing stove. The stove she'd never fixed, because it had become, in its listing, a kind of companion, familiar and imperfect in hers, and looked at the farm through the window. The flock in the yard, the field beyond it, the fence she'd mended and would mend again next spring, the prairie rolling out flat and patient and enormous in every direction. 11 acres, 39 geese, now 43 with the new births. Owen Barrett at the gate every morning. Frank Hennessy's note about 2 men walking fast across a north field at 2 in the morning. Jim Bellard's new granary going up on the north side. 16 farms with guardian geese in the valley, and more coming in the spring. She had requests she hadn't been able to fill yet, from farms as far as 2 valleys east, word having traveled the way Pearl had always said word would travel. She made a list. It was different from the early lists, the ones that had been survival arithmetic, the ones with 2 columns where her column was shorter. This list had 1 column, It was a list of what she was going to do next. She'd always known, somewhere in the practical center of her, that the world did not restructure itself around what you deserved. It restructured around what you built, and what you protected, and what you refused to let go of when everything sensible said to let go. That was not a comfortable truth. It was not a fair truth. It was just the truth. And she'd decided somewhere in the early February of this year, sitting at a listing stove with 37 cents and a piece of paper that said 11 acres, that she was going to work with the truth she had rather than the one she wished for. The geese had been part of that. Not the whole of it. The stubbornness was hers. The lists were hers. The decision to write to Frank Hennessy had been hers. The trip to Enid Marsh had been hers. But the geese had been the thing that made the space in which everything else became possible. 39 sick animals that everyone laughed at. And what they'd turned out to be was a flock that never slept fully, never decided things were safe, never stopped watching the road. She thought sometimes about what that meant, about what it said about the things that looked like weaknesses, the anxiety, the vigilance, the inability to relax into comfort, and what they were actually for when you put them in the right context and asked them to do the right work. The Prairie had tested everything she had, and what had survived the test was not her prettiest qualities. It was the ones people had spent her whole life trying to make her ashamed of. The stubbornness, the lists, the refusal to look away from an uncomfortable truth, the specific willingness to bet everything on an idea that no one else believed in. She folded the list and put it in her coat pocket and went out to check on the flock. The November afternoon was cold and still, the kind of cold that clarified things, the air so clean and sharp that the fence line at the east property edge was perfectly visible, every post distinct, and beyond it the road running north and south through the valley, and beyond that the prairie going on and on and on. Hazel was at the east fence. Abigail stood in her yard and looked at the old gray goose and thought about what Owen had said. She doesn't know it's over. And what she'd said back, it's not over for her. She just does now. That was right. That was exactly right. And standing in the cold November light on 11 acres that she owned, with a flock that had protected this land through everything the spring and summer and fall had thrown at it, Abigail Mercer understood that this was the part of herself she trusted most. The part that didn't know it was over, that just did now, that got up every morning and checked the fence and made the list and kept watching the road. She picked up the feed bucket. She went